They called it Hollywood glamour. But behind those perfect faces, something was rotting in the foundations. Toxic makeup, hidden chemicals, silent poisoning. And nobody noticed. Until it was too late. 14. Anne Dvorak. She moved through Hollywood like a woman who understood the price of beauty before the industry even had the vocabulary to describe the damage. Anne Dvorak had a face studios loved because it could shapeshift, playful, tragic, elegant, lethal. But the system she entered in the early 1930s was mechanical, everything optimized for image permanence, not safety. Makeup then functioned closer to industrial coating than cosmetic art. Lead-heavy pancake foundations were standard. Mercury oxide mascaras were common. These formulas weren't regulated. Studios preferred pigment longevity over biological compatibility, and became a test subject without consent. The irony is, she was more aware of artificiality than most actresses. She fought Warner Brothers over contract exploitation. She challenged typecasting. She was one of the few who intellectually understood that women were being commodified as optical illusions. But even she didn't fully grasp the chemical dimension of how the screen was burning women slowly. Her skin issues in mid-30s weren't random fluctuations. There are documented reports of her breaking out severely during peak production periods that correlates directly with being caked in lead-based max factor pancake makeup under unrelenting studio lights. That wasn't a rumor. That was occupational exposure disguised as a beauty routine. The rumor side, there were whispers that her fatigue and mood crashes in her late 30s were more than burnout, that she had been quietly poisoned by the constant toxic cosmetic microdosing. Nothing ever confirmed on paper. But the timeline always felt too aligned to just coincidence. Hollywood didn't kill her fast. It wore her down slowly. 13. Jean Harlow. Jean Harlow was the prototype platinum blonde, industrial product. She didn't become blonde, she was chemically manufactured blonde. Her hair wasn't bleached, it was assaulted. Early 1930s bleaching formulas were primitive, aggressive, and violently toxic. They mixed ammonia, household bleach, and later hydrogen peroxide in brutal saturation cycles until the hair basically became white straw. She did this constantly, weekly, sometimes twice a week when a film demanded continuity. This wasn't beauty routine. This was chemical warfare disguised as glamour. The tragedy is that her look became the global blonde standard. Every girl in America wanted it. Every studio wanted infinite clones of it. Jean became the blueprint that poisoned thousands of women indirectly because her artificial color dictated the palette for a decade. Even Mae West once said, "It hurts just to look at how much she must have gone through to get that color." The confirmed, documented side, Jean suffered repeated scalp burns, hair breakage so severe they had to wear wigs sometimes on set, and chronic infection risk. That is historical fact written in multiple production stories and crew accounts. The noir side. The rumors that lived under the floorboards. Some Hollywood insiders always believed the chemical assault weakened her immune system enough that when kidney failure came, she simply didn't have the strength to fight. Nobody ever proved the makeup caused the death. But this is where noir lives. Not in clear murder, but in slow, invisible harm disguised as glamour. Jean wasn't poisoned with a single lethal act. She was poisoned by a standard everyone celebrated. Hollywood didn't destroy her in a scandal, it killed her quietly while calling her iconic. 12. Max Factor. Studio victim class generic leading men case via Robert Taylor. Men in that era always pretended they were immune. They weren't. Robert Taylor became the perfect case study for male slow poisoning, not because he was the most extreme victim, but because he represented the exact prototype studio male who got damaged without anyone ever framing it as damage. He was the masculine jaw machine the studio wanted permanently flawless, and to achieve that flawless, they buried him under the exact same lead pancake formula the women endured, but men never got sympathy narratives later, so history rarely talks about their exposure. Taylor worked under brutally hot arc lights hotter than anything used today, which chemically accelerated transdermal absorption. That lead foundation would literally liquefy into sweat and seep deeper into pores while he filmed. Studio boys were told, "Don't complain, men don't whine about makeup," so they stayed silent and swallowed toxins like duty. Documented reality. Robert Taylor developed chronic skin irritation phases through 1938 to 1942, where makeup people repeatedly changed formula ratios to hide blotchiness and flaking. That is not random. That is allergic cumulative reaction patterns consistent with heavy metal contact. Rumor always whispered darker crew gossip that he would get dizzy spells in late shooting nights and chalked it up to tired from fencing training. But people who worked the pipeline said the dizziness was way too frequent to be just exhaustion. Taylor becomes critical because he proves this horror was not a female-only tragedy. Men were poisoned too. They just died less mythically and more silently. 11. Lucille Ball. Before she became television royalty, she was a studio grinder girl who did insane amounts of photo shoots and B-picture filler work, where makeup wasn't beauty enhancement, it was industrial coating. People think her poisoning talk is an urban myth. It's not. There is a reason she glowed on that X-ray test in 1950. That wasn't a supernatural comic punchline. That was residue of radium-based whitening products she used early career because they were marketed as skin brightness enhancers in the 1920s. They were radioactive, and she actually used them. Documented. Radium was marketed as miracle luxury. She even admitted she used it. Nobody educated women back then about chronic exposure damage. Studios didn't just ignore hazard warnings, there were no hazard warnings. Lucille had multiple skin breakouts in her early development years, and doctors never pinpointed the exact cause. What exactly do you think happens to skin cells when they are repeatedly blasted with both radium brighteners and lead pancake compounds and red pigment-heavy lip products that ripped the skin barrier? Her later claims of "I can't wear certain foundations anymore, I react violently" were not diva exaggerations. That was a traumatic memory. Quiet contamination history. Hollywood didn't kill Lucy, but it seeded hazard into her bloodstream like a ghost that just lived there for decades. And that is the noir tragedy. She survived the poisoning era long enough to become an icon. But every time her image gets celebrated today, people forget she earned that image in a lab disguised as a makeup room. 10. Linda Darnell. Linda Darnell is one of those cases where the beauty was so freakishly perfect that nobody considered the possibility that her beauty was actually being weaponized against her. Her face structure became the studio painter's reference sheet. She wasn't wearing makeup, she was wearing chemical sculpture. Early Fox studio makeup artists bragged about their perfect doll glaze finish they achieved with her. That glaze was a combination of thick foundation sealing agents, petrochemicals, industrial varnish elements. This wasn't MAC. This was a product born from military supply chain logic. Her skin during 1943 to 1946 was constantly stressed. She would be 6 hours under blazing lamps for glamour close-ups. That combination of heat-sealing agents created a literal incubator where skin could not breathe. She had multiple infection flare rumors, which people dismissed as jealousy gossip. It actually matches material science reality. When the skin barrier is trapped under that environment, microbacterial colony growth skyrockets. Then the rumor version. There were whispers she tried underground bleaching compounds briefly in her vanity period, some European origin. Nothing confirmed, but her skin tone did subtly shift at certain period photos in unnatural chalk brightness. That kind of shade shift usually means chemical stripping. Now, her final tragedy. Everyone knows the fire death story. Everyone sensationalizes that. But they ignore the irony. The industry built her like she was fire-resistant porcelain. In reality, she was chemically fragile for years. The poisoning wasn't a dramatic instant death. It was cumulative erosion long before the final flames. 9. Veronica Lake, the peekaboo hair legend. Every man remembers the seduction silhouette. Nobody remembers consequences. Veronica Lake single-handedly created a wartime beauty, epidemic women copying her hair curtain. But the studio also forced her into constant tint maintenance because that specific blonde shade only looked correct under nitrate film stock. So again, bleaching, aggressive, routine. Her hair and scalp were constantly in chemical warfare territory. Veronica's psychological volatility was always attributed to temperament and alcohol. Lazy interpretation. Women in that era using harsh bleaching compounds, mercury mascara, heavy metal lip pigments were absorbing microneurotoxins weekly. Chronic low-level mercury exposure absolutely can destabilize mood regulation. That is not sensationalism, that is biochemical possibility. Combine that with insomnia cycles from studio scheduling and you get a woman everyone calls unstable rather than chemically sabotaged. Makeup artists said she would sometimes cry when she brushed her hair because it would come off in clumps. They called her dramatic. No, that is chemical trauma. You can't keep stripping pigment and expect hair to survive. Her downfall narrative always gets blamed on personality flaws. That is the lazy dismissal the industry uses when it wants to bury its guilt. Veronica Lake became a ghost, not because she was weak, but because she was engineered into an artificial blonde identity that slowly disintegrated her from inside. Hollywood made her a visual weapon, then discarded the damage like waste material. 8. John Barrymore. People constantly frame Barrymore's decline around alcohol. Yes, he drank, but that becomes too easy. Barrymore was on stage long before the film, and the early-stage pancake makeup men used in the 1910s to 1920s was legitimately toxic. Lead. Straight. Chalk. Heavy. And men applied it with no skin prep and no cleansing discipline. Combine that with constant sweat and alcohol vasodilation and you have perfect heavy metal absorption conditions. He lived inside an industry where men didn't admit vulnerability, so none of his peers ever framed chronic neurological deterioration as possibly chemically induced. Barrymore's tremors, his speech degeneration, his memory fragmentation, historians all go alcohol only. That is naive. Chronic lead exposure creates neurological decline that can mimic alcoholism damage. The truth is he was probably hit from both fronts simultaneously. He wasn't slowly poisoned by a single villain. He was slowly poisoned by a cultural, masculine code that said, men don't get poisoned by makeup, that is a woman's problem. That blindness made it worse. He carried years of chemical residue inside his body, and everyone blamed only his vice rather than the ambient toxins embedded in his occupational life. Barrymore is the noir reminder. This poisoning wasn't gendered, it was systemic. Hollywood used poison as paint, and some men just crumbled slower, so history misdiagnosed the collapse. 7. Rita Hayworth. Rita Hayworth didn't just transform for Hollywood. She was chemically erased and rebuilt. She was born Margarita Cancino, dark Spanish hair, strong widow's peak, ethnic identity carved into her bone structure. Columbia decided America would never worship that, so they dissolved her. They forced brutal electrolysis to permanently burn off her natural hairline. Permanent. Skin literally cooked to reshape her face into an acceptable Hollywood geometry. She called those years the most painful of her entire life. Nobody cared. Beauty was a mechanical output. Then they drowned her in copper-based dyes and peroxide cycles to keep that flaming Rita red luminous under Technicolor. The color wasn't natural glow, it was the price of belonging. The chemicals that gave Hollywood its legendary red were quietly sinking into her scalp for years. Documented reality. Rita had long history of chronic fatigue, severe depression, mental deterioration accelerating prematurely. People love to blame genetics, trauma, men, fame. But everyone suspiciously avoids the obvious, slow burn. She lived 15+ years with constant chemical exposure on the most absorbent entry point of the human body, the scalp. No one can prove exact direct causality, but the timeline is too precise to ignore. Her identity was chemically extracted and remodeled, and her decline felt like a body that had been tampered with for too long. Hollywood immortalized her beauty, but the tragedy no one likes to say out loud is that Hollywood never even allowed her to keep her original biological self. 6. Judy Garland. Judy Garland wasn't poisoned by one thing. She was poisoned by all of it simultaneously at an industrial scale. From age 13, the studio treated her body like a modifiable production prop. Pills to wake up, pills to sleep, pills to shrink appetite, pills to numb anxiety. The makeup chair wasn't a sanctuary, it was another chemical pipeline entering her bloodstream daily. Her skin was constantly coated with heavy film foundation and adhesive mascara layers, so the camera could read her eyes as alive. But inside, she was dissolving piece by piece. The tragedy is that Judy was never allowed to exist in her natural biological state. She was created as an artificial sustained state, a manufactured state of performance. She didn't get to simply be a girl. MGM never gave her the right to be a biological organism. She was a visual instrument, and instruments don't have autonomy. Oh, her face and skin aged too fast for her age group. She was always exhausted. Everyone blamed her willpower. Everyone blamed her instability. They refused to admit the obvious. You can't subject a young girl to 10 years of pharmaceutical control, toxic cosmetic layering, and expect a stable mind. The poisoning wasn't dramatic like murder. It was slow-motion destruction disguised as professional grooming. Her death wasn't a sudden tragedy. Her death was simply the final concluding line of a long industrial poisoning that began before she was even emotionally mature enough to understand what adults were doing to her. 5. Clark Gable. Clark Gable's face sold masculinity to an entire nation. But that unshakable masculine myth was constructed with the exact same toxic powders and lead pancake base the women suffered under, and his studios demanded flawless consistency. He sweated ridiculous amounts under arc lighting, hotter than any modern set, which liquefied foundation into his pores every single shoot day. Combine sweat dilation, lead-based pancakes, and you get silent heavy metal microdosing across years. People always reduce his tragedy to his teeth. Yes, he had dentures early because he had chronic dental bacterial issues. But here's the part nobody talks about. Chronic mercury-based antiseptic compounds and early dental industrial chemicals were used constantly in actors like him. Mercury-lead combined chronic nicotine consumption nightmare cocktail. His mood volatility and chronic fatigue in late 1940s are usually blamed on combat stress and grief. That's only half true. No one ever questioned the chemical burden he carried from decades in makeup rooms designed like small industrial labs. Clark Gable represents the masculine poison archetype. Hollywood destroyed men the same as women, just without publicly acknowledging it. Because patriarchal mythology needed men to look indestructible. He wasn't, he just decomposed slower. 4. Joan Crawford. Joan Crawford was obsession weaponized. She was the single greatest self-maintainer in Hollywood history, and also one of the most chemically reckless. She believed beauty was war, and she fought war daily in her bathroom like a general. Crawford used whitening creams, exfoliating acids, harsh astringents, abrasive scrubs, and heavy pigment lip rouges with ingredients that today would legally require industrial handling disclaimers. The noir truth. She didn't just get poisoned by Hollywood. She collaborated in her own poisoning because she believed beauty and survival were the same currency. She did everything possible to keep her face camera lethal, and that required constant chemical battle. Documented. She famously scalded her face with boiling hot towels daily to purify skin before makeup, which destroys barrier function and increases chemical absorption. The pigments went deeper because she destroyed the protection layer herself. Rumor side, there were whispers in makeup departments that Joan used underground imported bleaching compounds 30s. More aggressive than the US market allowed because she refused to allow age to start on schedule. Her final irony, she outlived many of her peers, but never peacefully. She had the long, slow psychological erosion of someone who stayed chemically in battle too long. The poison didn't kill her fast. It became a lifelong ritual. Hollywood didn't break Joan. Joan broke herself trying to win a war against time that no chemical could ever truly help her win. 3. Bette Davis. Bette Davis never performed beauty. She weaponized it. She was the woman who refused to be ornamental. And because she refused to be ornamental, studios punished her indirectly by forcing her into harsher pigment, harsher liner, harsher contrast formulas than almost anyone else. Her eyes became the icon. Her eyes also became the site of chemical exposure. Nobody ever talks about mascara formulations in that era often contained mercury-based preservatives to keep them from rotting under hot lights. You think Davis's eyes just naturally looked radioactive? No, they engineered that effect with chemistry. Mercury, charcoal black, heavy wax compounds. She filmed in that for decades. Bette had chronic eye inflammation spells. People called it attitude. People called it diva punishment. People called it her being difficult. But that inflammation had a material cause. Toxic cosmetics plus constant intense lighting destroys the tear film barrier and accelerates irritation damage. That isn't speculation. That is physiology. 101. Rumors whispered she demanded harsher, darker, more violent pigment because she wanted to dominate the frame. That rumor always felt real because she understood visual power better than any man in that town. But the darker truth, the system was perfectly happy to give her those enhanced effects because the long-term cost wasn't their problem. Actresses were expendable. Bette Davis survived longer than most because she was mentally stronger than most. But that doesn't mean the chemicals didn't get to her. It means she carried the poisoning like a badge and refused to collapse fast enough for Hollywood to get the satisfaction. 2. Humphrey Bogart. Bogart's A Tragedy was disguised as masculinity. His entire brand was cigarette smoke, hard shadow lighting, lean fatalism, and low-register emotional pressure. And because he was the face of American noir, Hollywood didn't just encourage smoking. Smoking became a mandatory visual glamour around him. Cigarette smoke wasn't an aesthetic. It was a chemical inhalation pipeline. He was breathing film prop poison daily because the industry demanded smoke density to read on nitrate stock frames correctly. They used brands and blends with heavy tar and industrial additives because those produced thicker, denser smoke on camera. That wasn't normal consumer inhalation. That was theatrical poison for visual style. Combine that with lead-based pancake foundation under arc lamps. Combine that with chronic dehydration from alcohol and studio climate. Combine that with long-term exposure to these toxins without recovery cycles. Bogart becomes almost mathematically inevitable, a slow-motion collapse disguised as cool. He didn't crumble instantly, he eroded. Everyone tries to make Bogart tragedy romantic. That's nonsense. Bogart wasn't a romantic fatalist. He was a man that got chemically sanded down by a system that didn't care who died as long as the frame looked iconic. He died at 57 and people act like it was the inevitable destiny narrative. No, the machine consumed him early because the machine valued image more than biological survival. Humphrey Bogart was never cursed. Hollywood just poisoned him slowly and told the world it was charisma. 1. Marilyn Monroe. Marilyn Monroe is the final symbol not because she was the most poisoned physically, but because Hollywood poisoned her psychologically until the body simply couldn't carry the weight anymore. She entered the system already fractured poverty, childhood instability, trauma, and Hollywood realized that fragility was cinematic gold. So they engineered a persona that demanded constant perfection. The blonde was not natural. The radiance was not natural. The Marilyn identity was a chemically sustained illusion requiring constant maintenance. Hair bleaching, skin brightening, lipstick pigments, lash compounds, weight control substances, barbiturates for sleep, stimulants for energy. The body was never allowed to settle into natural baseline. She lived inside an artificial state. Nobody ever educated her on long-term neurological consequences of maintaining that constant chemical state. Pills became normalized not as escape, but as operational necessity. Hollywood didn't give her pills as vice. Hollywood gave her pills as workplace function. Her collapse was not a dramatic self-destruction. It was the inevitable endpoint of a woman that lived inside a manufactured chemical persona for too many years. She wasn't weak, she was outnumbered. The industry outnumbered her biologically and psychologically. She was a system product, and the system never cared what the long-term cost would be. Marilyn Monroe didn't die because she broke. She died because Hollywood trained her into a state where breaking was the only possible outcome. Hollywood didn't kill these stars in one violent strike. It killed them slowly, quietly, behind vanity lights, one chemical at a time. Their beauty wasn't natural, it was engineered on a toxic assembly line. And every one of them paid the price in ways the audience never saw. The next time you see Golden Age glamour, remember what it actually cost.